throughout my journey, I broke it down. I really wanted to assess at the animal behaviour within the landscape. Simple things. You find animals, they will avoid eating where they've pooped, obviously, most of us would. And also just that relationship with young stock versus mature stock and how they assimilate nutrients into their body tissue and where they redistribute it within the landscape. Wanted to visit cropping farmers around the world because they've been some of the first to utilise some of this novel technologies that's out there and see what we can apply into livestock systems. And the third one really was to engage with software providers where we can try and use some of this intuitive software to capture data that we can put back out and apply to our farming systems. So through Ireland, after that, that's when I really visited some of the behavioural scientists throughout the world in Scotland and Ireland as well. They were fantastic, and it really, in combination with the Global Focus program, galvanised who I needed to go and visit around the world to try and answer some of my questions. And I was really going to target research professionals, but along the way, make sure I use farmers, especially livestock farmers, as sounding boards to say, look, am I trying to bite off too much than chew? But the common theme is that once I put some of my ideas that I gleaned along the way and some of my own from my own farm, just the enthusiasm and that will to change is what really drove me to keep going, and hopefully at the end of this I'll keep practicing what I preach to try and bring this into the world. So optical sensors, it was a great place to start. I'm only looking at 2 to 7 channel sensors here on the screen, and they use light and thermal portions of the electromagnetic spectrum to really gain a growing plant's state of health. So, and with different algorithms you can apply to find out some biomass yields and some quality parameters as well. But when you've only got 2 to 7 channels, you can only really get 20 to 50% of a yield based or crude protein initiative from that. As with all products, there's a lot of them out there. Some work really well, and they're only as good as their ground calibration and the associated algorithms that work with them. One of the major limitations with these sensors is that they don't work so well with clouds. They're mainly good with monocultures, and so monocultures, multiple plant species, and they have to be calibrated to the quality that you're actually saying. So, another major limitation is that you can't actually tell which of the pastures have been preferentially overgrazed, or perhaps the watering point's too far away from where the actual biomass is in the paddock, and perhaps the stock aren't getting out there to graze it, and that might be some of your more profitable country out there. So, how do we overcome some of these problems? So up on the screen, the top, you have 2 channels sensor on the top right. That's the land gate, pastures from space. That's going to be extinct next year. What I found really useful was when I was in New Zealand. The second picture down is a MicroSense red edge near infrared camera, and this hyperspectral or multispectral analysis was really good for getting a snapshot in time to actually further go back and have a look where we need to do some further investigative research to find out what's limiting our pasture growth rates, and how can we actually address some of the nutrient deficiencies and put the nutrients out where we're actually going to get better bang for our buck. What I found most exciting on my trip in New Zealand, especially, is a spin-off from Massey University, a company called Hyperceptions. They've got a 620 hyperspectral optical sensor that they fit to the bottom of a plane. So in 20 minutes it can survey about 600 hectares down to sub-metre accuracy in pixel sizes. And with 98% accuracy, it'll tell you your metabolisable energy, it'll give you digestibility measures, and it's going to give you obviously the quality and the quantity parameters as well, and how fast it's actually growing. What I find really good is that we don't actually have to do invasive soils. I mean, it's specifically suited to New Zealand on some of the steep slopes where it's difficult to do grid-based soil testing. But to be able to analyse your nitrogen, your phosphorus, sulphur, potassium, all those macro elements from the sky, that's incredible and quite groundbreaking. But at a price of $500,000, this is obviously going to be out of reach for a lot of farmers. It's going to be a fee-for-service program, just rolled out this year over in New Zealand. So then moving on, this is an Australian company, and unfortunately, or fortunately for me, it was a lot easier to engage with Australian software providers, because these are the guys that are trying to, or they realise that we need to start capturing some of the benefits, because we've got so many pressures on us in terms of labour restrictions, high costs of freight, and getting our market, our produce through to market from the slaughterhouses. So it's an intuitive based software program. We can use livestock as a yield monitor. So a standard animal, a 50 kilo animal, is known as a dry sheep equivalent. We know how much product or quantity or biomass they eat using as a rubbery field yield monitor, and just by dragging and dropping your animals across that landscape, you can actually start capturing some of your grazing data from each of the paddocks and start feeding these paddocks based on their potential, or identifying some of your poorer performing paddocks that you can go back and do further investigative research. So what a lot of farmers around the world didn't understand when I spoke to them was that old stock, they eat the grass, they assimilate the phosphorus, and then they go to their latrine, which is generally in 5% of the paddock, and they relocate that phosphorus over there. They only use minuscule portions within that paddock. Whereas young stock, they go out there and they assimilate it, and it goes into their growing tissue, their bone and their muscle mass. So many farmers have the same weaning paddocks, nice and close, whether it be accessible to pastures or a single pasture type with a higher protein for when they're weaned. But they won't be preferentially feeding these paddocks, so what are they missing out on? So here up in Armidale, I went for a drive up there. You can see all the sheep here. They're grazing in the middle of that valley there, and here they're going up to chew the cud, and that's where they visit their latrine, and they're relocating those nutrients up into these portions of the paddock here. It's pretty simple. Why are we feeding fertiliser in these areas when we should be putting it down to where they're actually grazing it and removing it from the landscape? That was a pretty simple concept that was explained to me by Mark Trotter and over in the University of New England. Where things don't play out as well is probably more in the rangeland system or set stocking systems, where the animals have got lots of time. They establish fit for purpose stock camps. They graze in particular areas based on the pasture variety type, the quality of the pasture or its growth stage, and then they relocate it to those same spots over and over again. Whereas in high intensity grazing systems, you won't see this effect as much, whereas the stock are generally moved on after 2 or 3 days, depending on that stocking pressure. Israel, you've heard plenty of people say this is an amazing country, and I'm thoroughly glad I went and visited over here. And on the Golan Heights, here you have a cow it's fitted with a GPS device, an accelerometer. It's got a gyroscope in there. Costs about $300. It lasts about 10 years. They're pretty much bulletproof. They've been in production for about 20 years now, and I'm a bit disappointed I've only just found out about them. So effectively, these cows, they wake up in the morning, they eat a bit of grass, they do a bit of poo and away, they walk over a bit further and they chew their cud, bit of a poo and away, then they go up, have their camp, midnight snack, repeat over and over again. And if we can, what can we actually do with this information? Like, we've now got a walking yield monitor, like grain harvesters. And the chief scientists over there, after I talked to how I wanted to start approaching how I want to target my fertiliser in the areas where they're removing the most biomass rather than do invasive soil testing, because this is quite cheap. You can use like 5% of the herd, and because they always congregate around each other, it's quite a cheap process and a way to go about doing this. So we can also track the animals in expenditure, energy expenditure, its energy consumption, and then we can also determine its feed efficiency, because they've did a lot of analysis of the fecal component that's deposited, and with near-infrared analysis with 89% accuracy, they can tell how much the quality of the pasture is, and when they're actually going to start losing some weight as well. So there's a lot of issues here where we can, or opportunities really, where we can start knowing when our animals aren't performing. Do we need to start supplementary feeding, or do they need to be moved on to another paddock? So grid-based soil testing is essentially it's a common system really used around the world, and it's probably the most simplistic, where you're trying to lift a soil's potential to its agronomic optimum. Samples every 1 to 2 hectares, or I'll work on 2 hectares with a GPS location. It costs about $12 to $16 per hectare. That'll give the outputs of pH and phosphorus. Add more if you want to put potassium or sulphur on top of that. So based on historic pasture growth rates, this is all based on the average rainfall as well. So we're trying to lift the agronomic optimum and grow as much grass as possible based on the average. But what are we missing out on? Again, up in central Queensland and also in New South Wales, they're doing trial strips and croppers are doing this as well. They'll have a higher phosphorus or a higher nitrogen, or find out what the least limiting nutrient factor is, and feed that particular strip a lot more than it otherwise should have been, and seeing if there is a difference across that landscape. So, and utilising electromagnetic ground penetrating radar, you can also start to find some of these zones. So that might save you on a few costs. You might only need to target a specific area, to restrict the number of nutrient soil samplings that you actually need to do. And essentially the output you're getting here is up on that map on the right. That's just a phosphorus overlay of 3 to 5 zones, and where we can preferentially feed those areas. But I was left with a number of questions after I spoke to the guy in New Zealand about how he approaches this and what they're actually also missing out on, and how can we justify the costs of such an invasive and testing regime. So this is a typical output from up in Armidale, and you see that as we work through the slide, it's got a Colwell P of 30 units is the target for these soils based on the phosphorus buffering index. And as you see here, there's 3 zones that have been developed for each paddock, a low, medium and high, and based on the phosphorus buffering index, or the tank of a soil, that's another topic in itself, we can actually determine, based on a stocking rate of 12 dry sheep equivalent, how much product, or where we don't have to put any product at all, that we can apply to these zones. So it's just essentially trying to put fertiliser out. We're actually going to get a better yield response. In Australia and Ireland, people would say, look, variable rate, it's really only good for soil conditions like lime and gypsum. And so I'd sit down, I'd do the maths, and I agreed with them, trying to lift the pH up to like sort of neutral, so you can have a number of absorption sites increase. That's the best way to approach the system, so then you can store your macronutrients within the landscape. So lime spread at 2 tonne to the hectare every 6 years will cost you around about $50 to $60 per hectare. Phosphorus spread at 12 for that system that's up on the screen every year is going to cost you around about $50 to $60 per hectare. So that's every year. But we have to do both. If there's no point doing this variable rate phosphorus if we actually don't address the pH constraints first. So essentially, there's no point adding phosphorus to a soil that's already deficient in sulphur or potassium, because that really renders the whole program useless. I really wanted to dig into, obviously, understanding the animal's grazing behaviour within the landscape, and to do that, I had to understand the grazing intensity and the effect of having high numbers set stocking programs versus not having more extensive rangeland systems, and trying to understand the nutrient redistribution within the paddocks, which is absolutely rife. I mean, I'm a big fool for doing it on our farm. Why are we fertilising these areas where the stock are camping? And we really have access now to these novel technologies, these GPS tracking devices and accelerometers. We just need to validate them under Australian conditions. My objective number 2 was to explore the variable rate methods that these cropping guys have been using for some time, and what can we use in the livestock system. And so grid or zonal based soil testing is really the ideal system that we have at this stage. And also the use of optical sensors such as high perceptions will be something that we'll be using into the future, and that'll give you, they're great, those 2 to 7 channel sensors, for giving you a snapshot in time for where to best go back to investigate some of the agronomic restrictions. But farmers also have to understand that it's a shovel sometimes the best thing to do, to go out and dig a hole and see what's going on. And the third objective was obviously to develop the full potential of existing farm management software, and that's where the likes of the AgriWeb, which is an intuitive-based recording program, you can capture a lot of data there, so you can identify your good performing paddocks and your poor performing paddocks and feed them to suit, really. So my recommendations are for livestock farmers aim to make the adoption of variable rate fertiliser as a starting point and a lot simpler. One or all of the recommendations. There are a lot more in my report that's due to be released after the conference. I'd encourage you to go into we put a fair bit of work into these reports, and all of the Nuffield scholars are proud of what we put when we put our pen to paper. And I don't think you need to try and get overwhelmed by everything. You can use the start small or the nursery approach, and then just move on from there. Just choose where you want to start, and once you get that ball rolling, you're good to go. So the main one, adopt the use of farm management software like AgriWeb. It's simple. It gives you some basic parameters which you can apply and start objectively measuring the performance of your paddocks. The key really is that we want to apply phosphorus to sites that aren't already influenced or being restricted by another nutrient. So we really need to have it's crucial to understand what the least nutrient limiting factor is and address that in combination with any VR program that we roll out. And decisions can now be made where to allocate nutrients at zonal rates once you've identified 3 to 5 zones. I mean, using techniques of NDVI, they've been taken over the 20 years and then going out and correlating them with your soil test results. Then you actually start applying the zonal fertiliser rates out, and probably best to get an agronomist to sit down. If you don't have the skills or expertise, find someone who does. Now we need to find a way to measure the treatment responses objectively, find out what our cost benefit is, and this is the difficult part, unless you're going to go out and do pasture cuts. But I would suggest that in a set stock, a rotational grazing program, when you remove the stock from the paddock, take an NDVI image with a cheaper sensor, such as the MicroSense sensor they use in New Zealand, and then prior to stock being returned to that paddock, take another photo, and then you can actually compare rather than trying to determine the yield cuts per hectare, you can see, okay, what was the actual production benefit for that zone? So you've seen pretty simply that animals will really relocate nutrients amongst the landscape to areas that we're fertilising where we don't really need to. You've also seen that those sensors, we can actually measure this, but we're not actually doing. The technology's there, but it needs to be validated in Australia. What have we been doing on our farm? We've been engaging with funding bodies and research institutions to get these collars, some from up in the University of Armidale. We tried to get the ones from Israel over at the moment, so we can start validating them under Australian conditions, because I prefer not to have to do invasive soil techniques, but in saying that, while I've used electromagnetic and gamma radiation on our farm, it wasn't suited for our landscape where we've got a shallow water table and saline water table system. So we're going to proceed with grid-based soil testing on about 100 or 200 hectares of our farm, and then I've got some research professionals to come and help me overlay that with some of the old historic NDVI, or Normalised Different Vegetation Index maps, to see if we can extrapolate that over some of our other land as well to save on costs. I want to leave you with this statement that soil fertility manipulation for the livestock systems was found to return $84 per hectare in southern and Victorian grazing systems. And essentially, I just want to ask, how are each of you going to help capture this productivity benefit, and how are we going to make better use of our finite resources in this world? Thank you.